The first step in the workforce planning process is to identify the firm's business strategy. This may seem pretty easy. Most firms have some type of articulated business strategy that is placed in placards or in documents. So, for example, the vision or the mission, it's on the website, it's posted on walls. A lot of times the strategy is firmly articulated. It's in a document that the leadership team has got together and developed. But these are static documents, and oftentimes things change. So sometimes this information can be found in the day-to-day conversations with other key individuals, but it can also be found in the way that the leadership is addressing employees. Sometimes they'll be at an employee meeting and they'll say, well, we have this business venture going on, or we have this item that we're working towards. So they'll give some type of foreshadowing that something is coming up. So my point is, not only do you need to be aware of the items or the documents that are where they say this is our strategy, but you also need to be aware of how things are changing. The next step is to articulate the talent philosophy and the strategy for staffing decisions. One of the things that we're looking at is the percentage of individuals that we plan to hire from within the organization and the percent that we're going to hire outside the organization, but also how we look at individuals. Are they a resource that we want to be developed, or are they disposable commodities? One of the strategic decisions is the decision to be either proactive or reactive in staffing vacancies. Most of the organizations that I have worked for have been very reactive to openings, so they have waited until an opening has come open before they attempt to start filling that opening. One of the reasons for this is that organizations tend to see the hiring process as a cost function instead of an area where we can contribute to the organization and to the bottom line. So obviously the better our hires are, or the quicker that we make better hires, the less cost it's going to be in the long run. However, most organizations take a very short-sighted perspective on this. There are a large number of organizations, or a trend, moving towards being proactive in the hiring process, and part of this has to do with the war on talent. So when we talk about the war on talent, we're talking about the fact that there are a lot of unskilled individuals in the low-skilled labor market that are available for jobs. But when you start looking at the high-skilled labor market, the qualified labor market, there are fewer individuals that match our jobs. And so as we move forward with the baby boomers retiring, the labor market demographics shifting, more and more employers are moving towards a proactive approach, which is why it's so important for you to understand how to forecast and plan workforce planning and employment issues and decisions. In being proactive, the first step is to conduct a workforce analysis. Now here we're going to forecast both the internal demand for labor as well as the external supply for labor. So when we look at the external supply, we're not only looking at the local labor market, but depending on the types of jobs we have and the labor markets that we are working towards, we may be looking at a regional or national labor market or a specific skilled labor market. When looking at the internal labor demand, we would conduct a Markov analysis. This is called a transition analysis in the textbook. A Markov analysis would determine the movement of individuals within certain jobs. So do they move to other jobs? Are they being promoted or demoted? Transferring? Are they going to resign, or are they going to retire from the organization? So what we do is we look at a 2 or 3 year period, so there's a look back period there, that we look at to see what actually happened. How likely is it that the individuals are moving? So we're looking at a probability analysis of the percentage of people who would move or change into and out of a position. And then we look at the end at how many or how often we need to hire for that particular position. Most organizations that use reactive approach to staffing may also incorporate some form of judgmental forecasting. This is when you go to the supervisors and ask them, how likely do you think you're going to have an opening, and how many openings do you think you're going to have? So organizations that take a reactive approach may also incorporate this to some degree. However, when we're looking at a Markov analysis and we're forecasting the labor supply or the labor demand that we're going to have, one of the things that we might want to incorporate with this is the judgmental forecasting. The reason for that is that the Markov analysis takes into account the past history of the organization, but it doesn't necessarily take into account the future, what those individuals may anticipate or know is coming up. And that is just as important as relying on numbers, because if they know there's going to be a dip, then you want to include that in your forecast or make adjustments. The Markov analysis and the judgmental forecasting methods, they'll both tell you what your internal demand is, but you also need to know what your labor supply is. So the Markov analysis will tell you how many individuals you're going to have available when those positions come open and what the gap is internally. So when you look externally, you want to see what is the number of individuals externally that we have in the general labor market who could fill those positions. When looking at the external labor market, you have to consider the number of individuals who are in the labor market looking for positions, so the unemployment rate. You also have to consider the number of individuals who are graduating with the type of education or degree or certification that you're looking for. And so you have to look at the overall supply of the labor market, or the movement of people into the labor market. But you also have to look at the movement of people out of the labor market, so the number of retirees. You also need to look at competition for labor, so the individuals in the local labor market or the national labor market, depending on which labor market you're focusing on for that particular job. What is the competition like, and what is their demand for labor? And that's going to let you know if there's going to be a shortage of supply in the labor market, or if there's going to be excess labor in the labor market. Once you've gone through the process of forecasting both supply and demand, you're going to be able to identify what is the gap. So once you know what the gap is, what do you do with it? What do you do with this information? The next step is to develop and implement action plans. So the first thing you need to know once you've identified the gap is this a temporary gap, or is this a persistent and pervasive gap that we have to address? If it's a temporary gap or it's a short-term gap, there are some things that employers are doing, such as implementing technology or redesigning jobs. However, many employers are finding that there is a pervasive talent gap within the labor force that has to be addressed. So what do? A strategic perspective on shoring up long-term skill gaps is to influence the supply of labor. So one way to do that is to influence high school students who are moving into trade schools or colleges, influence the type of degrees that they're working towards. Manufacturing for a long time had a very bad reputation as far as being a career field to go in. They've worked really hard at changing the attitudes and perceptions of high school students so that they'll go into the skilled trades. Another way to address long-term talent shortages is through the Texas Workforce Solutions. They have funds through the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, and they partner with junior colleges like Temple College in order to provide workforce training to local employers. So this is one way you can increase your talent supply. Another way is to influence the types of degrees that students choose to get. For a while there, we had a huge shortage in teachers for K through 12. However, there was a big push on influencing individuals to move into the K through 12 environment, and so now we have a surplus of individuals in that environment. Another way is to expand the labor market. Of course, you can do this by redesigning jobs or accepting alternative education or certification and then growing the talent internally. However, you can also expand the geographical labor market, so looking at a regional, statewide, national, or even an international level. These are just some of the ways that you can use to address long-term talent shortages. Of course, with any process, you need to be sure to monitor, evaluate, and revise your plans as needed. In this video, we've talked about the workforce planning process. Each of the steps that go into the workforce planning and process, including identifying the firm's strategy, articulating the firm's talent philosophy and strategic staffing decisions, conducting a workforce analysis, developing and implementing action plans, and monitoring, evaluating, and revising forecast and action plans. When looking ahead to the exam, there's a substantial amount of information from Chapter 5 on the exam. In particular, when you look at the front of the chapter and it has the learning objectives 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are on the exam. So pay particular attention to forecasting and the Markov analysis. The next video will cover the Markov analysis.